What happens when the allure of the wild beckons, drawing humans into its breathtaking yet perilous embrace? From seasoned adventurers to unsuspecting tourists, these gripping tales reveal the stark reality that nature, while stunningly beautiful, can also be ruthlessly unforgiving. Each encounter serves as a chilling reminder of the wilderness's unpredictable power, where a single moment can shift from awe to terror. As the line between survival and tragedy blurs, these stories illuminate the raw courage and resilience required to face the untamed world beyond our comfort zones. Dawn was approaching in July 2022 as a vessel rocked gently amidst the shifting ice off Svalbard, its metal hull groaning under the pressure of the freezing waters. Aboard, 12 researchers, led by Dr. Adrian Wells, slept restlessly after another day of grueling fieldwork. Their mission, to document the rapid deterioration of Arctic ecosystems, was urgent, and the endless polar daylight only compounded their fatigue. They were a dedicated crew, but the nature of the work and their concerning findings were starting to take their toll on the scientists. So they slept, unaware that outside, under the pale glow of dawn, something moved in the water. An emaciated polar bear, skeletal from months of starvation, swam steadily toward the boat. Its usual hunting grounds had vanished with the retreating ice, forcing it into unfamiliar and desperate territory. For hours it had followed the faint scent of humans and food, its instincts overriding any fear of the strange structure. As it approached, the boat's low, steady hum seemed to call to it, promising survival. With a powerful thrust of its limbs, the bear reached the boat, claws scraping against the hull as it hauled itself onto the deck. Water poured from its matted fur as it paused, sniffing the air. The quiet was broken by a dull thud as the animal's massive paws hit the metal floor. Inside, no one stirred yet. The faint sounds blended with the creaks of the vessel. In her bunk, Olivia Marks awoke first. A marine biologist and light sleeper, she had been restless all night. The noise outside didn't register immediately, but as it grew louder, her unease deepened. She sat up and glanced out of the porthole, her breath catching in her throat. Despite its obvious emaciation, the bear was enormous, its ribs stark against its fur, its eyes hollow and unrelenting. Olivia barely managed a strangled gasp before the creature turned, focusing on the faint glow of the cabin's interior lights. The bear's first move was swift and brutal. It lunged at the cabin door, smashing through it with ease. Shards of wood and metal flew inward as the bear forced its way inside. Chaos erupted as researchers scrambled from their bunks. Adrian, closest to the door, tried to shout a warning but was cut off mid-breath. The bear lunged at him, its teeth sinking into his shoulder. Blood sprayed the walls as it shook him violently before throwing him aside like a broken doll. Olivia and Jacob Harris, a young geologist, were cornered near the galley. Jacob grabbed a chair, wielding it like a shield, but the bear swiped it away with a single blow. It knocked him to the ground, pinning him with one paw before tearing into him. His screams echoed through the narrow corridors, mingling with Olivia's panicked cries as she tried to flee. Then, they stopped. Jacob was gone. Sasha Patel, the team's medic, burst from her room, drawn by the commotion. She froze as the bear's massive head turned toward her, its maw dripping crimson. Sasha made a desperate dash for the radio, but the bear intercepted her, its claws raking across her back. She crumpled instantly, blood pooling beneath her as the bear roared and moved on. In the chaos, Dr. Henry Coates and Emily Lau, the ship's engineer, managed to climb to the upper deck. They huddled by the railing, gasping in the cold air, but their reprieve was short-lived. The bear, lost in its frenzy, leapt onto the ladder. Henry pushed Emily toward the edge, urging her to jump into the icy water. Before she could act, the bear lunged, grabbing Henry by the leg and dragging him overboard with it. His screams faded as he disappeared below the waves, leaving Emily trembling and paralyzed with fear. She ran below deck, not waiting to see if the bear would return. Below deck, Samuel Reyes, the team's logistics expert, tried to lead the others to safety. With him were Lauren Chen, a climatologist, and Victor Bell, an intern barely 6 months into his career. They barricaded themselves in the storage room, using shelves and crates to block the door. As they did so, the bear returned to the boat. The creature prowled outside the storage room, its growls reverberating through the thin walls. It sniffed the air, its hunger driving it mad. With a deafening crash, it began battering the door, splintering wood and twisting metal. Lauren clutched Victor's arm, whispering prayers under her breath. Samuel brandished a flare gun, his hand shaking as the door finally gave way. The bear surged inside, its jaws snapping. Samuel fired the flare, hitting the bear's shoulder, but it only enraged the beast further. It swiped at him, the blow sending him flying into the wall, where he crumpled lifeless. Victor tried to run, but the bear caught him, dragging him down as Lauren bolted past. Lauren sprinted blindly, tears streaming down her face. She reached the engine room where Olivia and Emily had taken refuge. They locked the heavy steel door behind her, their breathing ragged. Outside, the bear roared, its fury shaking the very walls. The three women huddled together, listening to the massacre above. Every thud, every growl, every agonized scream was a dagger to their nerves. Finally, the sounds began to fade. The bear, exhausted and partially sated, lumbered back onto the deck. It lingered near the edge, sniffing the air, before slipping back into the icy water. The survivors remained frozen, their breaths shallow, until the silence above was absolute. When they emerged, the scene was a nightmare. Blood smeared the walls, and the bodies of their colleagues lay scattered, mangled and lifeless. 3 more of their colleagues, Bill Abrams, Kate Corrigan, and Roderick Stetson, were also dead. The Arctic sun shone coldly on the devastation, indifferent to their suffering. In just 2 minutes, the bear had claimed the lives of 9 of their colleagues, leaving only 3 survivors to face the horror. Olivia, Emily, and Lauren stood in silence, their minds numb with shock. They were the sole survivors. 9 of their colleagues lay dead and mangled. The ice around them was vast, the horizon stretching endlessly. Eric Lawson had always lived for the wild, or at least that's what he told his subscribers. His YouTube channel, Survive the Wild, drew millions of viewers eager to see him navigate the untamed corners of the world armed with little more than a survival knife, a fire-starting kit, and his wits. In reality, Eric's passion for the outdoors was fairly recent. Still, he had spent the last 4 years of his life learning survival techniques and spending more time out in the woods than with his own girlfriend. In May 2018, he ventured into the remote forests of Idaho, planning to document a solo expedition. His goal was to demonstrate survival techniques near a river, perfect for lessons in fishing, food preservation, and fire-making. Unbeknownst to Eric, his chosen campsite sat dangerously close to a black bear's feeding grounds. Eric set up camp on the riverbank as the sun filtered through the dense canopy. His GoPro, mounted on a tripod, recorded every step. He built a lean-to from nearby branches, reinforced it with moss for insulation, and set a small fire near the entrance to keep predators away. The air was crisp and alive with the scent of pine and the sound of rushing water. By mid-afternoon, Eric had caught 2 sizable trout using a hand-carved spear. He held them up for the camera, a big grin plastered on his face as he explained the importance of finding protein-rich food in the wild. He cleaned the fish near the river, discarding the entrails into the water. Then he began smoking them over the fire, a process he narrated with practiced ease. But several hundred yards away, a black bear caught the scent of the fish and decided it wanted some of that trout. Hunger clawed at its belly after a long winter, and the promise of food was irresistible. It lumbered toward the source of the smell, its powerful nose guiding it through the underbrush. Eric continued his routine, oblivious. As the sun dipped lower, he adjusted his GoPro to capture the firelight reflecting off the river. He tested the fish's texture and made notes for his audience. The forest around him seemed calm, almost serene. Then a sound broke through, the snap of a branch. Eric froze. His experience and common sense had taught him to heed the forest's warnings. He turned toward the noise, scanning the dense foliage. At first, he saw nothing. Then the bear emerged. It was massive, easily 400 pounds, its black fur patchy from shedding its winter coat. Its beady eyes locked onto Eric, who instinctively reached for the survival knife at his belt. The bear paused, sniffing the air, then advanced slowly, drawn by the smell of fish. Eric backed toward his fire, hoping the flames would deter the animal. But the bear was beyond caution, driven by desperation. With a sudden roar, it charged. Eric lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the bear's initial swipe. He brandished his knife, its blade gleaming in the firelight. The GoPro, still recording, captured the chaos as the bear reared onto its hind legs. Towering over Eric, it lunged again, claws extended, and caught his arm. The force of the blow knocked Eric to the ground. Blood spattered the forest floor as he scrambled to his feet, clutching his injured arm and cursing through his teeth. The bear roared, saliva dripping from its jaws as it advanced. Eric slashed at the air between them, desperate to keep the animal at bay. But the bear was beyond fear. It charged again, knocking Eric against a tree. Pain shot through the man's back as the impact drove the air from his lungs. He struck out with the knife, landing a glancing blow to the bear's shoulder. The animal roared in pain but didn't retreat. Instead, it swiped at Eric's chest, tearing through his skin. Eric staggered, his vision blurring from the blood loss. He stumbled toward the fire, kicking up embers in a last-ditch effort to create a barrier. The bear hesitated for a moment, pawing at the hot coals, but its hunger overpowered its instinct to avoid the flames. With a deafening growl, the bear charged through the fire, scattering burning wood. Eric tried to sidestep, raising his knife, but the bear was too fast. It knocked him down, pinning him beneath its weight. Eric's screams echoed through the forest as the bear's jaws clamped down on his shoulder, its teeth grinding against bone. He fought back, stabbing at the bear's neck and face, but his strength was fading, and his knife couldn't penetrate the bear's thick fur. The GoPro recorded it all, the desperate struggle, the blood pooling on the ground, and the bear's unrelenting fury. Finally, Eric's movements slowed. The knife slipped from his hand as the bear shook him violently. With a final guttural growl, the bear released his lifeless body. It sniffed the air, its nose leading it to the smoldering fish by the fire. It ate greedily, tearing into the meat before retreating into the woods. For hours, the campsite remained eerily quiet. The GoPro kept recording, its lens fixed on the aftermath. Eric's broken body lay motionless, blood staining the ground around him. The fire had died down to embers, casting faint shadows on the forest floor. Days later, when Eric failed to upload his usual videos or respond to messages, his fans raised the alarm. Search and rescue teams scoured the forest, eventually locating his campsite. The scene they discovered was grim. Eric's body, partially buried under leaves and dirt, was found near the remnants of his fire. The bear had tried to cache him, a natural instinct for preserving food. His GoPro, miraculously undisturbed, sat on its tripod, still containing the footage of the attack. The authorities reviewed the video with heavy hearts. The raw footage showed the full extent of Eric's ordeal. Eric Lawson's death became a cautionary tale, a chilling example of the dangers inherent in survival challenges. Despite his expertise, the wild proved that no amount of preparation could completely eliminate the risks. In the days that followed, Eric's story made headlines, sparking debates about extreme survival content and the fine line between education and recklessness. For his fans, it was a devastating loss. The Smoky Mountains in June had a mesmerizing beauty that in June 2020 drew friends Jake, Emma, Mike, and Lily into its embrace. For the group of friends from Atlanta, the trip was meant to be a break from the grind of city life, some flavor in their otherwise bland routines. The forest around their campsite was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, the air crisp and fresh. They spent their first day hiking, laughing, and marveling at the untouched wilderness. By nightfall, they had pitched their tent in a clearing near a small stream. The night passed peacefully, the gentle hum of crickets lulling them to sleep. But just before dawn, Jake stirred to an unfamiliar sound. A soft shuffling, distant at first, grew steadily closer. He sat up, heart pounding, and strained to listen. The sound of heavy breathing reached him, accompanied by the crack of a twig underfoot. Jake nudged Emma awake as the noises grew louder. Soon the others stirred, their sleepy confusion turning to alarm as the shuffling stopped just outside the thin fabric of the tent. The first rays of sunlight illuminated the clearing, and then came the unmistakable sound of claws tearing into the tent's exterior. The tent collapsed inward as the black bear lunged, its powerful body ripping through the nylon like paper. Chaos erupted. Jake scrambled to his feet, yelling, while Emma clutched at her sleeping bag. The bear's massive form loomed over Mike, who was closest to the opening. The bear swiped at Mike, its claws tearing into his side with terrifying force. Blood sprayed across the tent as he screamed in pain. The others froze, paralyzed by the sheer violence of the attack. Mike tried to crawl away, but the bear was relentless. It bit into his leg, shaking him like a rag doll. Lily, her hands trembling, fumbled for the bear spray they had packed. She tore through their supplies, her breaths coming in short gasps as the bear's growls and Mike's cries filled the air. Jake grabbed a metal water bottle and hurled it at the bear, but it barely reacted. Finally, Lily found the spray. She crawled out of the tangled tent and raised the canister, her heart racing. The bear was focused on Mike, who had gone limp in its jaws. Lily aimed and released a burst of spray into the air around the animal's head. The bear let out a guttural roar, dropping Mike as it backed away. It shook its head, trying to escape the burning sensation in its eyes and nose. For a moment it looked as though the bear might charge again, but then it retreated into the woods, its snarls fading into the distance. The campsite was a wreck. The tent was shredded, their belongings scattered, and blood stained the ground where Mike lay. Jake and Emma rushed to him, their faces pale with shock. His wounds were horrific. Deep gashes ran across his torso and his leg was mangled beyond recognition. Emma ripped her shirt into strips, pressing them against Mike's wounds to slow the bleeding. Jake, his hands shaking, retrieved his phone from the debris. There was no service. They had to move if they were going to save him. Lily grabbed their first aid kit, while Jake and Emma fashioned a makeshift stretcher from tent poles and a sleeping bag. They lifted Mike carefully, his shallow breaths the only sign he was still alive. The nearest trailhead was over 3 miles away. Every step was grueling, the weight of the stretcher and their own fear pressing down on them. Lily kept the bear spray ready, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Mike's breathing grew weaker as they pushed forward, the uneven terrain and thick underbrush slowing their progress. Jake, leading the group, stumbled over a root and nearly fell. Panic flared in his chest as he thought of the bear returning, of the blood trail they were leaving behind. By the time they reached the trailhead, Mike was unresponsive. They flagged down a group of hikers who immediately called for help. Paramedics arrived within the hour, but it was too late. Mike succumbed to his injuries before they could reach the hospital. The remaining 3 were left in stunned silence, the weight of what had happened settling over them like a suffocating blanket. They had survived, but their group would never be whole again. In the days that followed, park rangers tracked and euthanized the bear, citing its increasing aggression as a threat to human safety. They believed the attack was spurred by food shortages in the area, a result of diminishing natural resources. The incident prompted the Park Service to implement stricter regulations on food storage and campsite safety. Jake, Emma, and Lily struggled to come to terms with their ordeal. The memories of that morning haunted them, the sounds of Mike's screams and the bear's growls replaying in their minds. For Lily, the weight of using the bear spray, saving the rest of them but failing to save Mike, was a burden she carried in silence. They would never forget that night in the Smoky Mountains. The ordeal would forever haunt their dreams. The forest was quiet that day in May 2011, with only the occasional rustle of leaves and the calls of distant birds breaking the stillness. Brian Simmons, a seasoned forest ranger with over a decade of experience, was patrolling a remote section of a national forest in Northern California. His job was straightforward: survey a rarely traveled trail for any fallen trees or signs of erosion. The path twisted through a dense ancient forest, where towering trees cast long shadows across the ground. Brian moved methodically, his boots crunching on the soft layer of pine needles. He carried a GPS, a handheld radio, and a map of the area, which he glanced at periodically, more out of habit than need. His routine was second nature, the result of years spent working in the wilderness. Yet no amount of experience could prepare him for what lay ahead. Unbeknownst to Brian, the trail wound dangerously close to a black bear's den. The mother bear, recently emerged from hibernation, had 2 cubs hidden in the underbrush nearby. Her senses were sharp, and her instincts were honed for one purpose: to protect her young at all costs. Brian paused to inspect a large, rotting log that had fallen across the trail. As he crouched to assess how to clear it, he failed to notice the subtle signs around him: the trampled grass, claw marks on nearby trees, and the faint scent of animal musk in the air. The wind shifted, carrying Brian's scent toward the bear. The mother bear emerged from the shadows, her powerful body rippling with muscle. She stood motionless at first, her black fur blending into the dense foliage. Her small, dark eyes locked onto Brian, and her ears flattened against her head. She let out a low growl, a warning he couldn't hear over the creak of his tool belt as he stood. When Brian finally turned, the bear was already charging. The suddenness of the movement made his heart lurch. She barreled toward him, her paws thundering against the forest floor. Brian's first instinct was to grab his radio. He fumbled to unclip it, his mind racing as he struggled to process the situation. He raised the radio to his mouth, but before he could speak, the bear was upon him. She struck him with a swipe of her massive paw, the force of the blow knocking him off his feet. The radio flew from his grasp and landed a few feet away, its screen cracked. Brian scrambled backward, his hand reaching for the hunting knife on his belt. The bear roared, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the trees. She lunged again, her jaws snapping inches from his face. He managed to draw his knife and slashed at her snout, the blade glinting in the dappled sunlight. The cut wasn't deep enough to harm the bear, but it was deep enough to make her angrier. She reared onto her hind legs, towering over him, then came crashing down. Her claws raked across his chest, shredding his uniform and tearing into flesh. Brian screamed, the pain searing through him like fire. Blood soaked his shirt as he tried to roll away. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. She bit into his shoulder, her teeth sinking deep, and shook him violently. His vision blurred as he struggled to stay conscious. Desperation took over. Brian swung his knife again, this time plunging it into the bear's side. She let out a deafening roar and released him, stunned by the wound. He used these precious seconds to crawl toward his radio, each movement agonizingly slow. He reached out, his fingers brushing the device, but the bear was on him again. She pinned him with her massive weight, her claws digging into his back. The knife slipped from his grip as she bit down on his arm, her powerful jaws crunching bone. Brian's strength was fading. His attempts to fight back grew weaker, his body trembling from blood loss and shock. The bear, sensing his diminishing resistance, shook him once more before tossing him aside like a broken toy. He landed hard on the forest floor, his breathing shallow and ragged. The bear stood over him, her fur matted with blood, her breaths coming in heavy snorts. She stared at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether the threat had been neutralized. Finally, she turned and lumbered back toward her den, leaving Brian alone in the clearing. The forest fell silent again, the sounds of the attack fading into the stillness. Brian lay motionless, his blood pooling beneath him, soaking into the earth. His vision darkened, the towering trees above him blurring into indistinct shapes. He tried to move to reach for his radio one last time, but his body refused to obey. When Brian failed to check in later that day, a search team was dispatched to locate him. It wasn't until the following morning that they found his body, sprawled on the forest floor near the shattered remains of his radio. The bear's tracks were still fresh, circling the area before leading back into the woods. The news of Brian's death sent shockwaves through the park ranger community. He was experienced, cautious, and well-trained. Yet the wilderness had claimed him in a brutal, unpredictable moment. His colleagues mourned the loss of a friend and mentor, while administrators grappled with the implications of the tragedy. In the weeks that followed, the park implemented stricter safety protocols for rangers working in bear habitats. Rangers were equipped with bear spray and mandated to carry firearms during solo patrols in high-risk areas. Educational campaigns emphasized the importance of recognizing signs of bear activity and maintaining a safe distance at all times. The forest, for all its beauty and serenity, held perils that could strike without warning. Brian's colleagues took solace in knowing that his death led to changes that might save others. But the loss of a life so dedicated to protecting the wilderness was a pain that lingered long after the forest had returned to its quiet, indifferent rhythm. The sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of Wyoming's forest, casting long shadows over the clearing where Sarah and John had parked their car. The couple, exhausted from a full day of hiking, trudged back to the clearing. The air was cool, and the forest around them had grown quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Their car stood at the edge of the clearing, a faint glint of light reflecting off the windows. It wasn't until they were within a few yards of it that they noticed the hulking form of a grizzly bear standing beside the vehicle. Sarah froze, her heart racing as the massive animal sniffed at the air, its nose pointed toward the cracked window of their car. The faint scent of food drifted on the breeze. They had stored their provisions in the back seat, believing the vehicle would keep them safe. But now, that small oversight loomed large. The bear pressed its weight against the car, pawing at the window. A loud crack shattered the stillness as the glass gave way under its strength. The bear's head pushed through the opening, its jaws snapping as it dragged out a bag of food. Wrappers crinkled as the bear tore into the food, oblivious to the couple watching in horror. Gathering his courage, John stepped forward, his hand raised to deter the bear. Sarah whispered his name in a desperate attempt to stop him, but he was already moving. The bear's head jerked up, its dark eyes locking onto John. For a moment, the clearing seemed to hold its breath. Then the grizzly charged. The speed was staggering. In a matter of seconds, the bear was on him, its massive paws slamming into John's chest. He went down hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. The bear reared up, its towering frame blocking Sarah's view. John struggled beneath the animal, his arms flailing as he tried to shield himself. The bear swiped again. This time, blood spattered the ground, the bright red stark against the dark earth. John howled in agony. Sarah screamed, as if she too could feel the sharp claws tearing her apart. But her voice was drowned out by the bear's deafening roar. She looked around frantically for anything she could use to help. Stones, sticks, anything. Her hands closed around a jagged rock, and she hurled it at the bear. The rock struck its flank, but the bear barely flinched. The grizzly bit down on John's shoulder, the crunch of bone audible even from where Sarah stood. John thrashed weakly, his strength fading. The bear shook him like a toy, dragging him a few feet before releasing him. The animal paused, its sides heaving as it sniffed the air again. Sarah stayed rooted to the spot, her chest tight with fear. For a brief moment, she thought the bear might turn its attention to her, but it lumbered back toward the car, its interest reignited by the food it had scattered. Sarah rushed to John's side, dropping to her knees beside him. His face was pale, his breath shallow and ragged. Blood pooled around him, soaking into the dirt. She pressed her hands against the gaping wounds on his chest, trying to stem the flow. Her hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, praying for a signal. The bear rummaged noisily through the car, oblivious to the human suffering it had left in its wake. Sarah's mind raced. She had no idea how long it would stay distracted, or if it would attack again. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and darkness was closing in. She tried to keep John conscious, shaking him gently as his eyelids fluttered. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed harder against his wounds, the sticky warmth of his blood coating her hands. The bear suddenly lifted its head, its ears swiveling. It had finished with the car and now stood motionless, sniffing the air. Sarah held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. She closed her eyes and waited for the attack, but it never came. She didn't dare open her eyes until several minutes had passed. By the time her eyelids fluttered open, the bear was gone. The clearing fell silent once more, but Sarah's terror remained. She pulled her jacket off and used it to cover John's wounds, applying as much pressure as she could. His breath grew fainter, each one a struggle. Minutes felt like hours as she stayed by his side, whispering words of encouragement he could no longer hear. She tried to lift him, but his weight was too much for her to carry alone. The forest seemed to close in around them, the fading light casting eerie shapes through the trees. When headlights finally pierced the darkness, Sarah collapsed in relief. A group of campers, drawn by her distant screams, had found them. They rushed to help, using their first aid kits to stabilize John as best they could while calling for emergency services. But it was too late. By the time the ambulance arrived, John's body had gone still. The paramedics worked in silence, their faces grim as they loaded him onto the stretcher. Sarah sat on the ground, her hands and clothes soaked in blood, staring blankly at the shattered remains of their car. Rangers tracked and euthanized the bear, citing its aggressive behavior as a threat to public safety. Sarah's story became a somber, cautionary tale in her community. For her, the forest would never again hold the same sense of wonder it once did. The memory of that day, and of John's final moments, was a wound that would never fully heal. The forest trail was serene as Lisa and Greg Miller walked under a canopy of vibrant green, their terrier Max trotting happily ahead. The couple from Portland, Maine, had chosen this remote trail to get some much-needed exercise. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and Max's occasional sniffs and excited pawing at the ground. The trail wound deeper into the forest, narrowing as they climbed a gentle slope. Lisa paused to take in the scenery while Greg rummaged through his pack for a water bottle. Max darted around, tail wagging furiously, before freezing mid-step. His ears perked, and a low growl escaped his throat. Lisa turned to see Max staring intently at a dense thicket ahead. Before she could react, Max erupted into loud, frantic barking, the sound echoing through the forest. Greg called for the dog, but Max didn't stop. A sudden movement in the underbrush made Lisa's stomach twist. Something large was there. The black bear emerged with alarming swiftness, its massive frame cutting through the foliage. It stood on all fours, its head swinging toward Max as it let out a guttural huff. Max's barking grew louder, more panicked, as the bear advanced. Greg dropped his pack and ran toward the dog, waving his arms to distract the bear. Lisa shouted, frozen with fear, as the scene unfolded too quickly for her to process. The bear lunged at Max with terrifying speed. The dog darted backward, but the bear's claws raked across his side. Max yelped in pain, his small body tumbling to the ground. Instinct took over as Greg grabbed a branch from the ground and charged at the bear, swinging wildly. The bear rose onto its hind legs, towering over him, its size and power dwarfing Greg's desperate attempts to protect Max. It swiped at Greg, the force of its paw knocking him to the ground like a rag doll. Lisa screamed, the sound piercing through the chaos. The bear then dropped to all fours and lunged at him, its jaws snapping. Greg rolled to avoid the bite, but the bear's claws tore into his leg. Blood seeped into the dirt as he kicked at the bear, trying to push it off. His efforts only seemed to enrage the animal further. Lisa grabbed a rock and hurled it at the bear's back. It turned its head briefly, its dark eyes locking onto her. Her breath caught in her throat. The bear growled low and menacing before refocusing on Greg. It bit down on his arm, the sound of bones cracking cutting through the air. Greg let out a cry of pain, thrashing in vain beneath the bear's weight. Max, wounded but alive, limped toward Lisa, whining pitifully. She scooped him up, clutching him tightly as she backed away, her mind racing for a way to save her husband. Greg's struggles grew weaker, his movements sluggish. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the forest floor. The bear roared and shook its head, tossing Greg's limp body aside. Lisa's heart sank as her husband lay motionless, his face pale and streaked with blood. The bear turned toward her, its massive body blocking the trail. She stumbled backward, clutching Max as the bear advanced. A surge of adrenaline propelled Lisa into action. She turned and ran, her legs burning as she sprinted down the uneven trail. Behind her, she could hear the bear's heavy footsteps, its growls growing louder. Max whimpered in her arms, his small body trembling. The forest blurred around her as she focused on escaping, her breaths ragged and her chest tight with fear. The trail split ahead, and Lisa veered left, hoping to lose the bear in the maze of trees. She ducked under low-hanging branches, her feet slipping on loose dirt and rocks. The bear's snarls echoed behind her, relentless and closing in. Her strength was fading, but the primal will to survive kept her moving. She spotted a fallen tree ahead and scrambled over it, one of her hands gripping the rough bark. Her arms ached from carrying Max, but she refused to let go. The bear crashed through the undergrowth, undeterred by the obstacle. Lisa pushed herself harder, her legs trembling as she ran. The sound of rushing water reached her ears. The trail opened up to a narrow stream, its cold water sparkling in the sunlight. Lisa splashed through it, her boots slipping on the slick rocks. She glanced back and saw the bear pause at the water's edge, its chest heaving. For a moment, she thought it might give up the chase. But the bear roared and leapt into the stream, its powerful stride sending water flying. Lisa's heart sank as she realized it wouldn't stop. Her foot caught on a hidden root, and she fell hard, the impact jarring her body. Max yelped as they hit the ground, but Lisa tightened her grip on him. The bear loomed over her, water dripping from its fur. Its teeth were bared, and its growl vibrated through the air. Lisa shielded Max with her body, bracing for the attack. The bear bit down on her side, tearing a chunk of her flesh with ferocity. Suddenly, a sharp whistle pierced the forest, followed by the sound of a voice shouting in the distance. The bear hesitated, its ears twitching. Lisa didn't wait to see what had distracted it. She crawled to her feet and stumbled away, her vision blurred by tears, exhaustion, and pain. She knew she should feel excruciating pain, but the adrenaline helped her move. The shouting grew louder, and she spotted a figure running toward her, another hiker. The man carried a large stick and waved it wildly, yelling to deter the bear. The bear snarled but backed away. its dark eyes watching Lisa as she collapsed onto the trail. It huffed one last time before retreating into the forest, its massive form disappearing among the trees. The hiker reached Lisa and helped her to her feet. She was bleeding heavily. Lisa clung to Max, her body shaking uncontrollably. The hiker led her to safety, guiding her through the forest until they reached a ranger station. There, Lisa finally let herself break down, the weight of what had happened crashing over her. Help was on the way. Greg's body was recovered later that day, his injuries too severe to survive. Lisa's own wounds were treated, and Max, though scarred, survived the ordeal. The attack made headlines, sparking debates about the risks of hiking with pets in bear habitats. New campaigns emphasized the importance of proper precautions, including leashing dogs and avoiding food scents near trails. Lisa never returned to the forest. The memories of that day haunted her, a painful reminder of how quickly nature's beauty could turn deadly. The scars on her body and Max's fur served as a permanent testament to their encounter with the wild, a sobering lesson paid for in blood.